At 07:15, 4 Ukrainian FP-2 strike drones lifted off from a tree line 8 kilometers behind Ukrainian positions and turned southwest toward a Russian fuel train moving through occupied Luhansk. The last drone had barely cleared the trees when their control links lit up across the battle space, bright enough that anyone listening could feel the launch like a flare. The operators didn't know it yet, but the hunt had already started. 20 kilometers to the north, a Russian R-934 direction-finding vehicle had been waiting since midnight. From the outside, it looked like another military truck, until you saw the dish antennas on the roof, each sweeping the spectrum, searching for one thing: Ukrainian drones. When those FP-2 control signals went active, the R-934 classified them in a fraction of a second, frequency hopping in the 1.2 to 1.4 gigahertz range. Power output consistent with a field control rig, and definitely not Russian. One bearing doesn't win you anything. A bearing is just a line to infinity. So a second R-934, positioned about 25 kilometers to the northeast, grabbed the same emissions from another angle. Now the lines could cross. Now the math could bite. Both feeds rolled into a Borisogledsk 2 command truck that fused the bearings with timing differences, microseconds that translate into kilometers when you multiply by the speed of light. 23 seconds after the first control packet left Ukraine, a coordinate popped out the other end. That coordinate didn't go to an analyst, it went to a launcher, because in this sector, drone detected automatically triggered suppression, fast enough that the first answer often arrives before the drones reach their own handover point. And the Ukrainians, still watching 4 tiny icons crawl toward the rail line, had no idea a battery of rockets was already lifting its tubes. Their objective was simple and brutal. A fuel train headed for the Dovzhansk depot. Miss this train, and the next one wouldn't arrive for 72 hours. That's 3 days of engines that don't start, trucks that don't move, generators that go quiet, and units that suddenly feel the front line in their legs instead of their tracks. But before the train, before the depot, before any fireball on the rail yard, there was a problem much closer. 31 kilometers away, a BM-21 Grad battery received the coordinates and didn't need a committee meeting. Hydraulics whined as 40 tubes elevated. The fire control computer corrected for wind and started the sequence. The operators heard it before they saw anything. That rising, tearing sound of rockets igniting in a ripple. Different from artillery, more like a zipper being ripped open across the sky. Time to impact, 60 seconds. The team leader did the geometry instantly. Each rocket carried explosive with a lethal fragment radius around 30 meters. 40 rockets in a pattern didn't threaten the launch site. It erased the grid square, hundreds of meters across. And their launch position sat near the center of that box. So why not cut control and run? Because the drones weren't fully autonomous yet. Cut the link too early, and the FP-2s would start hunting for their command signal, circling, drifting, possibly turning back toward friendly airspace. The strike would die before it reached Russian defenses. They needed about 20 more seconds to reach the handover point, where the drone's onboard computers would take over navigation. That meant holding the control rig steady while 40 rockets arced overhead. 15 seconds. The whistle was audible now, not one note, but a chord of approaching steel. 10 seconds. The drones crossed into contested airspace. Autonomy kicked in. 5 seconds. The team leader yanked the power cable on the control unit. 3 seconds. Both operators dove into their vehicle, engine already screaming. 1 second. Tires spun and the vehicle lunged forward. Behind them, the tree line didn't explode once. It detonated in a rolling walk of impacts. 6 seconds of thunder as rockets stitched the grid square. The blast waves slapped the vehicle from about 200 meters out. Fragments punched the tailgate. They kept driving. 4 FP2s continued southeast on pre-programmed waypoints. The humans had survived. Now the drones had to survive. Meanwhile, the fuel train kept rolling south at about 60 kilometers per hour, pushing into the window where an FP2 strike would actually matter. And Russia was already waiting on the next ridgeline. A Tor M2 battery near Starobilsk had been tracking the incoming drones since they crossed into range, about 38 kilometers out. The system sat on high ground with a clean line of sight across a broad valley. On paper, Tor should be the nightmare for small drones. It can track dozens of targets. It reacts fast. It's built for low altitude. But Tor has a bottleneck that matters when drones come in as a problem set instead of a single target. While the search radar can track many returns, the engagement channels are limited. The fire control system can only illuminate a few targets at a time with narrow beams that must stay on target all the way to impact. Break that beam for more than a moment, and the missile loses guidance and self-destructs. Ukrainian planners built the approach around that bottleneck. The operator saw a formation that looked designed to stress him. One high drone around 2,000 meters, flying straight and steady, almost too clean. One mid-altitude drone around 500 meters, weaving just enough to complicate prediction. 2 low drones around 200 meters, using every fold of terrain like armor. Then the low drones dropped even lower, down toward 50 meters, right as the Tor shifted from search sweeps to continuous tracking. They felt the change. When Tor commits, the signal spikes. Stay up and you eat a missile in seconds. The battery commander didn't panic fire. He used disciplined ripple doctrine. Launch 2, assess, then launch again if needed. 2 9M338 missiles erupted from vertical tubes. They didn't chase the drones directly. They climbed to a calculated point and then dove for impact, using the angle to improve radar return and add gravity to the closing speed. The high drone held its line. Straight enough it looked like a decoy you could hang your confidence on. The first missile's proximity fuse triggered at close range and turned it into fragments. 10 kilometers away, the fuel train cleared another junction. The clock didn't stop just because one drone died. The low pair didn't just duck, they threaded real obstacles. One drone dropped toward a river valley and then pulled up sharply because his forward camera caught power lines strung across the cut at about 20 meters. Clip those cables and the mission ends right there in a shower of sparks. So it climbed to clear the wires, then immediately shoved back down to the deck. From the Tor operator's chair, that one little climb was exactly the kind of move that should have made the drones easier to kill. Instead, it carried them into the next problem for the defender: terrain. That valley sat lower than the surrounding ground, creating a pocket of radar shadow. Even with an electronically steered beam, the Tor couldn't bend around the earth in the hills. The drones dipped into the cut and simply vanished off the scope. The middle drone tried to dive as the next pair of missiles launched, dropping from 500 toward 200 meters. It didn't matter. Tor wasn't aiming at where it was aiming at where it would be. The interceptor arrived at the predicted point precisely as the drone reached it. Another detonation, another target deleted. Now only the 2 low drones remained, and the Tor commander understood the real danger. The drones hugging the ground were the ones carrying live warheads. The high and mid drones were there to buy time and absorb missiles. The low pair did something that looks passive but is deeply deliberate. They stopped maneuvering. Any turn, any climb, any aggressive correction increases radar return and makes prediction easier. So they went straight and level, minimizing cross-section, becoming holes in the sky. The battery tried to reposition for a better angle, but moving a Tor is not turn the steering wheel. It's lower the radar, start the tracks, drive, stabilize, raise the radar, recalibrate. 4 minutes if nothing goes wrong. In those 4 minutes, the surviving drones gained 12 kilometers. They popped up briefly at the eastern end of a valley. Tor launched again and found only empty air as the drones dropped into a railway cutting and vanished behind terrain. By 0737, both FP2s had cleared the Tor's engagement envelope. 60 kilometers ahead, the train was reaching the depot area. And at Dovzhansk, the Russians weren't guessing anymore. They were ready. Since midnight, an R330 jammer truck had been parked near the Dovzhansk rail depot to protect fuel transfer operations. It looked like another military truck until you noticed the antenna arrays and the fact that the air around it sounded like a storm to anything trying to navigate by satellite. The system broadcast high-power interference across a wide radius, enough to crush GPS reception in the approach corridor. At 0755, both FP2s entered the jamming zone. On the drone side, the effect was immediate. GPS receivers that had been tracking satellites with meter-level accuracy suddenly heard static. Satellites transmit from 20,000 kilometers away. By the time the signal reaches the ground, it's weak. A jammer a few kilometers away can shout over it. The drones switched to inertial navigation, accelerometers and gyros maintaining heading based on the last good position. But inertial systems drift. Every minute adds error. Give it 5 minutes and you can be tens of meters off course. Enough to miss a building, enough to strike a rail spur instead of the train, enough to turn a mission into wasted fire. That's why the humans were still in the loop. About 180 kilometers away, Ukrainian operators watched their video feeds degrade as the jamming intensified. Frame rate fell from smooth to choppy, 30 frames per second to 10, then 5. Resolution collapsed from clear to blocky. Inputs developed lag, each stick movement taking almost half a second to show on screen. That delay is a quiet killer. At full speed, half a second means the drone has already moved tens of meters before you see the result. It turns precision flying into prediction. So the operator stopped trusting feel and started working like a machine. Manual exposure down to cut glare. Focus locked so the camera didn't hunt. Frame rate priority over resolution. And a constant mental buffer for lag. The second operator didn't look at the world in color at all. He stayed on thermal. Metal holds heat differently than earth and concrete. Rail tracks show as parallel lines. Tanker cars loaded with diesel glow as bright rectangles even through smoke and haze. On thermal, the depot looked like a lit-up map, 2 hot rails pointing straight into a ladder of tanker cars. The Russians could see the jammer was doing damage. On a spectrum analyzer, the jammer operator watched the drone link hopping across the 5.8 GHz band. He tried everything: barrage jamming, spot jamming, sweep jamming, anything to crush the control channel and force a loss of guidance. But the FP2 radio hopped too fast across too many channels. Even flooding most of them still left momentary gaps. Enough for packets to squeeze through. Enough for control. In the rail yard, soldiers were completing the fuel transfer, pumping diesel from the train into underground storage. The pumps ran. The hoses stayed connected. The depot was doing the exact thing it had to do for the front line to move. 2 drones were 5 kilometers out, 90 seconds to impact. At 800, the first FP2 hit the third tanker car at roughly 67 meters per second. It wasn't a Hollywood explosion. It was a structural failure so violent it looked like the car had been squeezed too hard. A 105-kilogram warhead created a shock load far beyond what a tanker car is designed to survive. The steel ruptured and diesel erupted outward in a long, burning cone. Fuel poured along the track bed and pooled under adjacent cars. Heat rose fast. Pressure relief valves began opening automatically, venting vapor straight into open flame. One valve, then another, then another. Within 30 seconds, 5 tanker cars were fully involved, each one adding tens of thousands of liters of fuel to the inferno. And the second operator didn't rush the follow-up. He waited exactly 30 seconds after the first impact. He needed the secondary pops to settle just enough for the thermal picture to stop saturating. He needed to see through the smoke and identify the next node, the transfer building that connected rail cars to storage. At 30 seconds, gaps appeared in the thermal bloom. A rectangular outline emerged through the noise, the transfer building. He pushed forward.
20 seconds later, the second FP2 arrived from the east, aligned not on the brightest fire, but on the upwind side, the angle that would spread flame across the depot instead of letting it burn in one place. The drone entered terminal dive from about 400 meters. Impact at 0801. The building held massive fuel volume, hundreds of tons in the system. The initial blast bulged structures outward. Then the fuel-air mix found the worst possible balance, just right for a hard secondary explosion that hit like a punch. Windows shattered in Dovzhansk, 3 kilometers away. From the outside, it looked like the depot had inhaled and then exploded. From the inside, it was more brutal. Pumps and hoses failed instantly, fuel lines ruptured, and fire spread into the exact places you can't isolate quickly. Under structures, along pipes, into storage interfaces. The jammer operator's power meters were pinned, equipment heating from sustained output. It didn't matter. The drones had already done the only thing they had to do: reach the yard and turn fuel transfer into a firestorm. On paper, the train schedule put it at the depot around 0805. In reality, the operation had already been decided before that schedule could matter. Less than a minute after the first impact, the depot was no longer a depot. It was a burning obstacle to every unit downstream that expected diesel on time. Russia detected the drones early, triangulated the launch in seconds, and answered with a full Grad suppression salvo. Tor M2 took kills, but the decoy geometry and terrain masking pushed the fight into dead zones and reacquisition delays, long enough for 2 low drones to slip through. The jammer at the depot made control ugly. Lag, freezes, degraded video, but it couldn't fully sever the link, and 2 impacts were enough.